I had an external, I'm paraphrasing now, an external expression of what we went through, like a lost limb or two, blindness.
That alone is bad, but when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it gets worse. That result at Martinsville was Wallace's second straight finish of 34th or worse, 2 races in a row where he has basically come home with nothing to show for it. And what makes that sting even more is where he was in the standings just a few weeks ago. He was sitting second in the Cup Series points. Second, right near the top of the whole field, looking like a real contender. Now, after Martinsville, he has dropped all the way down to 11th in points. That is not just a rough weekend. That is a momentum collapse at a time in the season when you really cannot afford one. After the race, you could hear in Wallace's voice just how frustrated he was, and not just about the crash. He talked about how much they were looking forward to Martinsville. It is one of his favorite tracks, and they had a sponsor on the car with Hardee's, and everything felt like it should be a good weekend. They even looked fast in practice. But when Sunday came and the race got going for real, they just could not put it all together. That is a tough pill to swallow, especially when you feel like you had the tools to do well and it still fell apart. And the pattern Wallace mentioned, looking quick early in the weekend but not being able to convert that into race results on Sunday, is something that has shown up before with this team. It is the kind of thing that teams work on for months, and when it keeps happening, it really starts to weigh on everyone involved. The one silver lining, if you want to call it that, is the timing. NASCAR has an Easter break coming up before the next race, which means teams get a little bit of time to breathe, reset, and regroup. For Wallace and 23XI Racing, that break might come at just the right moment. Getting some mental distance from 2 brutal weekends in a row before heading to Bristol Motor Speedway on April 12th could be exactly what they need. Bristol is another short track, similar energy to Martinsville, so the pressure will be right back on quickly. But at least they have a moment to step back and figure out what went wrong before they have to go do it again. One more thing worth mentioning about the Wallace situation is what it might mean going forward in terms of how other drivers treat him on the track. Racing has a long memory. When you put someone in the wall the way Wallace put Hocevar in the wall, especially in a moment that did not seem to call for that level of aggression, other drivers notice. They file that away, and the next time the 23 car is racing close to someone, you can bet that moment at Martinsville is going to be somewhere in the back of their mind. That's just how racing works. Now, let's talk about the complete opposite end of the emotional scale, because Chase Elliott gave NASCAR fans something to feel genuinely good about at Martinsville. Elliott picked up his first win of the 2026 season, and it was his 22nd career Cup Series victory. And just like the Wallace story, the way it happened is what makes it so worth talking about. For most of the race, Elliott was not the guy everyone was watching. He started 10th and spent a big chunk of the afternoon running outside the top 5. While he was doing that, Denny Hamlin was absolutely putting on a show. Hamlin started from the pole position and led 292 of the first 317 laps. That is not just a good race, that is dominance. At that point in the afternoon, it looked like it was going to be Hamlin's race unless something strange happened. And then something did happen, though it was not strange. It was smart. On lap 312, crew chief Alan Gustafson made the call to bring Elliott down pit road earlier than the other main contenders in the race. In the moment, it felt like a gamble. Pitting earlier than your rivals means you come back out with fresher tires, but it also means you give up track position right away, and you're betting that a caution is going to come out at just the right time to give you that position back to you. Fans love this kind of call when it pays off, and absolutely cannot stand it when it doesn't. This time, it paid off in a big way. The caution did come out, and suddenly Elliott found himself with track position when everyone else restarted. Ross Chastain briefly grabbed the lead by staying out on older tires, but Elliott got by him quickly once the race went back to green. After that, nobody could touch him. He led the final 69 laps and crossed the finish line 0.565 seconds ahead of Hamlin. In a race like Martinsville, that margin is not nothing. That's a comfortable win at one of the toughest places to hold someone off. Behind them, Joey Logano came home in third, with Ty Gibbs fourth and William Byron rounding out the top five. His marriage to Livia Giugioli had, on the surface, looked like something from a romantic film. They met in the early 1990s while he was working on a production in Italy. She was a production assistant with a warm Mediterranean energy that was the complete opposite of his reserved British nature. Where he was careful and measured, she was passionate and spontaneous. Friends say she completely broke through his usual guardedness, and for someone who had always kept people at a slight distance, that experience was both exciting and a little overwhelming. He was drawn in not by any desire for status or attention, but by what seemed like her genuine passion for life, for art, for making the world better. They married in 1997 in a small private ceremony. They had 2 sons together, Luca and Matteo. What was less publicly known was that Luca had been born before their marriage, the child of a previous relationship of Livia's. Colin adopted him without hesitation and raised him as his own. People who knew about this admired him enormously for it. It seemed like proof of who he really was, a man capable of deep, unconditional love. But looking back, some close to him suggest it also established a dynamic that would define much of the marriage. Colin proving himself, Colin accommodating, Colin bending to hold things together. At some point, that kind of devotion stops looking like strength and starts looking like someone terrified of losing the life they have built. The family divided their time between London and a beautiful villa in the Umbria region of Italy. The Italian property became Livia's passion project. She turned it into an eco-conscious retreat, a place for environmental workshops and sustainability events. Colin supported it all, financially and emotionally, standing quietly behind her vision and telling anyone who asked that he was proud of her drive and purpose. The media portrayed them as a couple with genuine values, grounded and thoughtful, raising their children away from the superficiality of Hollywood life. On red carpets, Colin often appeared alone, explaining simply that Livia preferred meaningful work over celebrity events. People found that admirable. What they could not see was a man slowly disappearing into the background of someone else's story, making himself smaller so that her world could feel larger. There were signs, subtle ones, that those closest to them noticed over the years. Livia was the decision maker. Colin agreed. She had strong opinions about which roles he should take and which did not align with the image their family represented. He accepted that influence without visible resistance. He spoke about her in interviews with deep admiration, but always in terms of what she stood for, rarely in terms of how she made him feel. Being needed had become his purpose, and what he had not yet confronted was the difficult truth that being needed is not the same thing as being truly valued. The collapse began in 2018. Italian media reported that Livia had filed stalking charges against a journalist named Marco Brancaccia, a man she had known since childhood. She claimed he had harassed her for years, sending threatening messages and showing up without invitation. Colin immediately and publicly supported his wife, calling the situation deeply distressing for their family. The British press largely framed the story as a straightforward case, Livia as the victim, Marco as the obsessive figure who could not leave her alone. But the truth behind that story was far more complicated. What had not been made public was that during 2015 and 2016, Colin and Livia had quietly separated. They had told only a small number of close friends that they were stepping back from the marriage to reassess things. During that period of separation, Livia had reconnected with Marco, and what started as nostalgic conversations between old friends eventually became a full romantic affair. They were seen together in Italy, far from the reach of British tabloids. When Colin and Livia reconciled in late 2016, she ended things with Marco. But the ending was not clean. His messages afterward were emotional and raw, the kind that come from someone who feels suddenly discarded after believing they had meant something real to another person. Livia called those messages harassment. Marco said they were the natural, painful aftermath of a relationship that had meant something. And Colin, not knowing the full truth, took his wife's side completely. He offered her his public support, his legal resources, and his personal reputation, all of it used to reinforce a version of events that was at best deeply misleading. Then, in 2019, the case collapsed entirely. Livia withdrew the charges and released a statement acknowledging that the relationship with Marco had been consensual. Marco had evidence, real messages, that showed the relationship had been mutual and that his contact afterward had come from heartbreak, not malice.
The fallout was severe. The Italian press reacted with fury. Much of the British media was quieter about the update, seemingly reluctant to tarnish the image of one of the country's most respected actors. But the damage to Colin himself could not be contained. He had been humiliated in two separate and devastating ways. First, by the affair, the knowledge that his wife had been with another man while they were separated and had chosen not to fully disclose what that relationship meant. And second, by the deception, by the fact that he had been used, unknowingly, as a weapon in a legal case built around a distorted version of events. He had stood in front of the world and defended something that was not what he believed it to be. People close to Colin say he was destroyed by it, not just hurt, but fundamentally shaken. He had spent his adult life trying to be a man of honesty and integrity, both on screen and off. Now he found himself cast, not by choice, as the naive figure in someone else's lie. Everything he had believed about his marriage, about his wife's character, about what their life together had actually been, became uncertain in ways that could not easily be resolved. Unlike in the films he had spent a career making, there was no script for what came next. In December 2019, Colin and Livia announced their separation in a carefully worded joint statement. They spoke of maintaining a respectful friendship and co-parenting with privacy. The language was controlled and calm, the product of people who had negotiated what could and could not be said. The divorce was finalized in 2020, the worst possible timing in many ways, as the world went into lockdown, and isolation became both a physical and an emotional reality. His sons were adults now, living independently. The Italian villa, once the symbol of a shared dream, became just another item to be divided up in legal proceedings. Friends noticed the change in him during this period. He was quieter, more withdrawn. The easy warmth that had once come so naturally now seemed to take effort. He turned to therapy, not just to deal with what Livia had done, but to honestly examine his own role in the years that had led there. Had he ignored signs he should have seen? Had he confused devotion with avoidance? Had the man who always kept the peace done so because he genuinely believed in peace, or because conflict felt too dangerous to risk? These are the kinds of questions that do not come with satisfying answers. They just sit with you and ask to be taken seriously. Professionally, the years that followed brought their own quiet difficulties. The pandemic had paused the entire film industry, and when it restarted, the landscape had changed. Colin was in his early 60s, competing in a world that had moved toward digital platforms, social media visibility, and younger faces. He had no social media presence, no interest in chasing trends, no appetite for reinventing himself in the ways that modern Hollywood often rewards. Roles that might once have been offered to him automatically were going to others. It was not a dramatic fall, but a gradual fading, the kind that happens when an industry moves in a direction you have no desire to follow. His personal life became a constant subject of media speculation after the divorce. Every public appearance with a woman was turned into a headline. Dinners between friends were reframed as potential romances. He was linked to various women in 2021, but nothing developed into anything lasting. By 2023, there were reports of a connection with a BBC producer, someone he had met through work, but as always, he refused to comment, and whatever it was quietly ended. By 2024, those close to him described him as single and, perhaps surprisingly, at peace with that. There is a particular kind of acceptance that comes after repeated disappointment. It is not quite happiness, but it is not defeat either. It is simply the quiet decision to stop waiting for life to look a certain way and to find meaning in what is actually there. For someone who had defined so much of his identity around partnership and family, arriving at that place likely required real effort and real grief, but he got there. As of 2025, Colin Firth continues to work, choosing smaller independent films and returning to the theater where everything began. He is closer to the stage now than he has been in years, and there is something fitting about that. Live performance demands a kind of honesty that cannot be hidden behind editing or retakes. His relationship with his sons is reportedly strong and warm, though deliberately kept out of the public eye. At 65, he has stopped performing the role of the man who has everything together, and in that honesty, there is something more interesting and more real than anything Mr. Darcy ever offered. The real story of Colin Firth is not about a marriage that ended, or a wife who lied, or a career that slowly shifted into quieter corners. It is about a man who spent most of his life loving in silence, giving without asking, and protecting a version of himself that the world found easy to admire. And then it's about what happens when that version cracks open and the actual person underneath is left to figure out what comes next. That process is never clean or cinematic, but it is, in the truest sense, human.